Good morning, students, or afternoon, or evening, or whatever time it is when you're watching this. Today we're going to discuss Chapter 27, which are all about vertebrates. So, chordata, right? The chordates. These are fish, amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. Chordates are anything with a backbone, but they also have other characteristics that we need to keep in mind. They have a notochord and a dorsal hollow nerve cord. They have pharyngeal slits and a postenal tail. In some organisms, these happen as adults, but in most of them, it's in embryonic development that we see some of these things. In addition, vertebrates have a vertebral column, so it's the bony column protecting that dorsal hollow nerve cord. They have a cranium, an endoskeleton that is made some of cartilage, many of bone, and multiple clusters of Hox genes. You can see the vertebrates are broken into clades. We have the cyclostomata that we talked about in Chapter 26, our hagfish and lampreys. We have chondrichthyes, which are animals with a cartilaginous skeleton. We have the bony rayed fishes, we have bone lobe-finned fishes, we have amphibians, we have reptiles, and of course, mammals. You can see that each of these classifications breaks down into different groups based on the things that we find. We find lungs, then we find lobe fins, limbs, an amniotic egg, milk and hair, jaws versus no jaws. These are the innovations that separate the different phylum of organisms in the vertebral or chordate categorization. When we look at these clades and see most of these phylum, we can see there are additional sections under them, like reptiles would also have turtles or lizards and snakes or crocodiles and alligators, and mammals show birds animals show a classification of birds that stem from the reptiles that are different from mammals as well. So as we were talking about in Chapter 26, the cyclostomata, hagfish, and lampreys, they are marine fish that lack a jaw. They don't have fins, and they don't have that vertebral column. They do have not the bones, but they still have the notochord, and they do have a cartilaginous skull or cranium. Essentially, they're blind, but they have an amazing sense of smell, which helps them find prey and avoid predation. They secrete copious amounts of slime. And oftentimes we see with hagfish and lampreys, there's a differentiation, right? So the lampreys are jawless, but hagfish would have a hinged jaw and a few true appendages. They do have a notochord and a rudimentary vertebral column, so we do see them split and start to form more of those traditional chordate or animal characteristics. They are found both in marine and freshwater, not just in marine life. And lampreys can be parasitic as adults. So after we look at the vertebrates as a whole, now our next subphylum are gnathostomes. The gnathostomes are the jawed vertebrates, and we see a hinged jaw develop here. The jaw is developing from the pharyngeal gill slits that perform the oxygen exchange in embryonic development. The evolution of a modified jaw comes as we lose some of the gill arches in development. So as we develop a jaw, one of the great things we start to see is an increase in predators. We see these predatory capabilities being exacerbated because now they have the means to be able to bite and clamp with their mouth as well. When we talk about the gnathostomes, the class that we're talking about are chondrichthyes. These are the cartilaginous fish like sharks and rays. These are organisms that have a cartilaginous skeleton. So their skeleton is not bone. It is very flexible. They do have derived characters that are special or different and change from what the ancestral lineage had. And so the developmental change prevents the ossification of, in our case, we have the bones that we can leave behind. Well, in sharks, that cartilage, it doesn't ossify. There's no ossification. So if you can't go mineralized from bones, there's no remnants left behind with regard to the skeleton of the shark. Sharks are among the earliest fish to develop teeth, but teeth are not set in their jaw. If you look, they have these rows and rows of teeth, and they're just made to grow through and lose them and lose them and lose them constantly, and that's why there's so many shark teeth found throughout the world. Sharks are denser than water, and so they have to continually swim in order to remain buoyant, floating in the water, and also to help them breathe. They do have a dual-chambered heart, but single circulation. They have an incredibly powerful sense of smell. They have a lateral line, and this detects pressure waves, and it helps them to keep their balance and to go after prey and other things. They do reproduce through internal fertilization, and they do have some interesting characteristics derived with regard to fertilization. They oviparous, lay eggs, but some are ovoviparous. So the egg is retained in the female, but there's no placenta. And then viviparous, eggs develop in the uterus and the placenta nourishes the lungs. And so there's 3 different ways that they can go. You can have many different ways that organisms are going to develop their offspring. And so if you look at this one over here in the middle, you can see the shark egg pouch. And so the egg is laid and fertilized, but it's outside of the shark. And so that would be oviparous. Our next subgroup will be the osteichthyans, and osteichthyes are the bony fish. There are a few different clades or classes in the osteichthyes bony fish category. These include actinopetrygii or ray fin fish, and the fins are supported by little flexible rays. They're thin and bony, and then they're okay, I can do this, I promise. Sarcopterygi, lobe-finned fish, and the fins are supported by the skeletal extension of the pectoral pelvic area. So they actually are moved by the muscle. So the lobe-finned fish move their fins, but the ray-finned fish, they're more like bony area, right? This also includes lungfish and tetrapods. So 3 features that distinguish the osteichthyes from the chondrichthyes are bony skeleton, the operculum, which covers and allows ventilation of the gills. So instead of having the gills open and exposed, they are covered and protected. And then the swim bladder, so they don't need to constantly move in order to keep their buoyancy. When we look at the lungfish, they actually use lungs and gills. They can breathe in water, but a lot of times they live in oxygen-poor fresh water. And so they use the lungs to breathe too, and these would be the early ancestors to the tetrapods, right? These were going to come before things could live on land with like amphibians, where they can use lungs but breathe their circulatory system. They take oxygen in through their skin. So the transition to land happened in the Denovian period, and the adaptations for limbs came in order to help with locomotion, reproduction, and they had to find ways to adapt to prevent the desiccation of their eggs once they were laid. We know amphibians lay their eggs in water, but other tetrapods chose to go a different route, and we will look at how reptiles adapted to a more terrestrial environment. Sturdy lobe-finned fish became animals with 4 limbs, like this believed transitional species, the dactylique, right, that we talked about in lecture before. Their vertebral column is strengthened. Their hip and shoulder bones brace against their backbone so that they have more stability to be able to move on four limbs and walk on land. And they have relatively simple changes in gene expression that affect having those limbs and using those limbs, and those are regulated by their Hox genes. Our next class we get to is the amphibians, and amphibians made the jump to land, and they could live on land. However, they had to return to the water. The water is where they reproduce. They cannot have their reproductive eggs outside of the water, or they will just dry out and die. They also have a buccal pump, which forces air into their lungs. Buccal is like cheek, right? And their skin absorbs oxygen. All these things help these organisms be able to maintain life in and out of the water. Amphibians have a 3-chambered heart, and they do undergo external fertilization. Again, the larval or developmental embryonic stages are all aquatic, and they do regulate their metamorphosis or change from that tadpole and egg into a juvenile and an adult by the thyroid. Amphibian eggs develop into tadpoles, and the tadpole is an aquatic herbivore, and so they also have a tail, right? It's that fish-like post-anal tail that's letting them swim through the water to be able to eat, and then they breathe through gills. So all of those things that we talked about that make vertebrates, the classification for a chordate, they exhibit these in embryonic development and early development. During their metamorphosis, the tadpole loses the gills and the tail and develops limbs and lungs. So this is like human development. We see this happen as well, even in us. There are some different orders of amphibians that include frogs and toads, which is about 90% of the amphibians. And then there's a separate order for salamanders and one for caecilians. And these are blind tropical burrowers. And they look almost like centipedes or millipedes or like weird snake things with legs, right? They use uterine milk to nourish their young inside the mother's body, which is a little bit different. And they are secondarily legless, so they lost legs over time. A few species of salamander show petamorphosis, and you can see, look at how amazing these organisms look. Their legs are so far apart and they are long and stretched out, tiny little limbs, but their bodies are still able to move quickly. And then the adult salamanders have all the larval characteristics like the other amphibians. There are some frogs and toads that are carnivorous, but all their aquatic larvae are primarily herbivores.